Today we're looking at the Bible, and most of you know the Bible's in two parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. We're going to be focusing on the Old Testament today, okay, the first half of the Bible, if you like. Now, the Bible is made up of 66 books. There's 66 books in the Bible, and it was written over a time span of about 1,600 years. There's not many books that you can get, but there aren't any books that took 1,600 years to make. It's a serious book. And the time frame was in between 1500 BC and AD 100. So 1500 years before Jesus was born, and then the Bible carried on being written for 100 years after Jesus was born. Okay? And it was written by more than 40 authors. Again, it's not common that you would get a book with 40 authors. Now, these are some of the authors. You've got Moses, who was a political leader. He was also a judge, and he was trained in the universities of Egypt. He was also a shepherd. He's one of those guys who's like, I know how to do that. That's Moses. Then you've got David. He was a king. He was also a poet. He was a musician. He was a shepherd as well, and he was a warrior. Then you've got Amos, one of the prophets, who was a herdsman. There's something about shepherds and the Bible. Then you've got Joshua, who was a military general. You think of like Norman Schwarzkopf back in the first time they went into Iraq with the big guns. Joshua was a big military general. Then you've got Nehemiah, who was the cupbearer to a pagan king. Then you've got Daniel, who was a prime minister. Then you got Solomon, who was a king and a philosopher. Luke was a physician and a historian. Peter was a fisherman. You kind of feel bad for them there. It's like, what? He's just a fisherman. But look how key he was later on in the early church. Got Matthew, he was a tax collector. And back then they were looked down. They would be like your local drug dealers. They'd be looked down on in that way. Then you got Paul, who was a rabbi. And then you've got Mark, who was Peter's secretary. So you've even got a secretary in there. All these guys are authors of the Bible. There's more authors than these, but these are just some examples. Now, the Bible was written at different times. David wrote in times of war and sacrifice. Solomon wrote in times of peace and prosperity. They had completely different lifestyles, David and his son Solomon. They were written in different moods as well. Some books were written from joy and others from sorrow and despair. Books like Lamentations, very sad. Then you've got books written during times of certainty, when people knew what was going on, and there were other times of uncertainty where the Jewish people have been exiled and they don't know what's going on. And some of the Bible's written in that time, times of confusion and doubt. Now, it's also written in loads of different places. Moses wrote his part in the wilderness, that's the desert. Jeremiah wrote his part in a dungeon, underground dungeon. Daniel wrote it on a hillside and in a palace. Paul wrote it inside prison. Luke wrote whilst travelling, so he was probably like on a boat and he'd be writing, and he was travelling all over the place. And John, whilst he was on exile on the island of Patmos, the last disciple living, all of them got killed, and you had John, and they put him in exile on the island of Patmos, and he wrote the book of Revelation then. So the Bible's been written in all kinds of different places. It's been written on 3 different continents: Asia, Africa, and Europe. It's quite deep if you think about it. Someone says, here, I've got a book for you. It was written in Asia, Africa, and Europe. Then it was written in a variety of writing styles. You've got poetry, you've got historical narrative, you've got personal letters written from like Paul to people like Timothy. You've got biography, you've got law, prophecy, parable, and allegory. It's quite a big book. It's written in 3 different languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. The Old Testament is predominantly in Hebrew, New Testament predominantly in Greek. Got bits of Aramaic around the place. It covers controversial topics. Everything's there in the Bible. Even topics like incest are there in the Bible. But yet all of the writers agree on these. Got 66 books, more than 40 authors, and they all agree. And all on different continents and different places, and yet they all agree. Very unusual. In fact, I don't think you could find anywhere where if you got 66 books, put them together and found they would all agree. Wouldn't happen. And all of the books provide a single unfolding story. You start off with Genesis, and that talks about paradise lost. You know, the Garden of Eden, we mess up and we lose paradise. The gate to the tree of life is shut. Then at the end, the last book of the Bible is Revelation, and that talks about paradise regained. Jesus comes back, and you get new heaven, new earth, and the gate to the tree of life is opened. So that's the theme in the Bible. And you've got one leading character during the Bible, throughout the book, and it's God, who's revealed as Jesus. He's the hero of the book. Now, going to focus on the Old Testament. How did we get it? How on earth did we get this Old Testament now? I don't mean, did we get it from W.H. Smith's? Was it printed by Zondervan? I mean, where did it come from, and how on earth did we get it in our hands today? So, first off, the Old Testament was written, as I said, between 1500 BC and 400 BC. Okay, now during that time, you started off with Moses being told by God to write in a book. That's recorded in the book of Exodus. It says that God told Moses to write in a book. Then you had, over the next 1100 years, you had other writers who were inspired by God to write other books. And together, these writings were put on leather scrolls and other materials that were called the Hebrew Scriptures, or the Old Testament, which also means the Old Covenant. Okay. Now, you've got Old Testament. It's tricky to find old manuscripts because they were either written on stone, or they were written on clay, or they were written on leather. So not much stuff has survived. You know, you've got fragments, but it's very hard to find books in like a whole book together, say like the book of Genesis. You won't find it together because of the materials it was written on. It's very hard to find. Now, there's 39 books, but if you were reading a Jewish Bible or talking to a Jewish person, they would tell you there's 24. Guess what? Both of us are right. Because what the Jewish people do is they put some of the books together. So they put 1 and 2 Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings all together, and that's counted as one book. So the Jews don't have any less books than we have. It's just the way they put them together. So like Lord of the Rings is a book with 3 books inside it. Most of us would say there's 1 book. But you could also say, oh, you know those 3 books. And you could go through it like that. So these 39 books, once again, were written between 1500 and 400 BC. So the Old Testament was finished 400 years before Jesus came on the scene. Now, most of it's written in Hebrew, which is a pictorial language. So in it, the past isn't just described, but it's actually verbally painted. An example is, he arose and went. He opened his lips and spoke. He lifted up his eyes and saw. He lifted up his voice and wept. Very pictorial. It doesn't mean the Bible's mythical. It just means the language they used was a very pictorial language. This is the way they spoke. Now, these are the categories of the Old Testament. You've got the law, the prophets, and the writings. The law is also called the Pentateuch, right, which is the first 5 books of Moses. Then you've got the prophets, which includes the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Because although Samuel is written as like a historical narrative, Samuel was a great prophet. All the Jewish people saw him as a prophet. He performed wonders in prophesying. So when he wrote down a historical account, they would be like, yes, this is from God. We're going to read this by association. Then you've got the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the book of the 12 prophets, which in the English Bible we put into 12 separate books. But here it's called the book of the 12 prophets. Then you've got the writings. This is Psalms, Proverbs, and Job, which are poetical books. And then you've got the 5 scrolls. Now the 5 scrolls, you probably haven't heard them called that before. It's the Song of Songs, it's Ruth, it's Lamentations, it's Ecclesiastes, and it's Esther. They are called the 5 scrolls. Then you've got Daniel, and you've got Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, all come under the writings. So those are the divisions of the book. If you hear us say the law and the prophets, when you hear people say that in the Bible, the writings is included in that as well. The writings is included under the prophets. But if you're going to be technical, you'd say the law, the prophets, and the writings. Now, around about 450 years before Christ, tradition, and when we say tradition, we're talking about history. Jewish history. We don't know this for sure, but tradition says that Ezra, who actually wrote a book in the Bible, Ezra was a priest and a scribe, and he collects and arranges some of the books of the Hebrew Bible around this time. So people kept hold of manuscripts that were written by people like Samuel and by Moses because they knew they were great men of God, and they knew they spoke from God and performed wonders. People like, well, these prophets would do all kinds of crazy things. So people were like, we're going to keep their books. But tradition says Ezra actually then put them all together. He was a scribe, and we're talking about the time where the Jewish people have been kicked out of their own country, taken off to Babylon. So there's a big worry, like, we need to make sure we keep our holy books in order. Tradition says Ezra put them all together. Now, 250 to 100 years before Christ, you had the Septuagint written. You can call it the Septuagint or the Septuagint. It's the first Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. It's in Hebrew, but it was translated into Greek by Jewish scholars in Alexandria, Egypt. Around this time, everyone spoke Greek. They called it the lingua franca. Okay? Everyone was speaking this language, and so they put the Bible into the Greek language, which is good. It means everyone could read it. Now, the word Septuagint means 70, and this refers to a tradition that either 70 or 72 men translated it. There's a story about these guys being put in 70 separate cells and made to translate it in 70 days. We don't know that that's true. I've heard a guy say that it's probably not true, but that's where the name comes from. And sometimes you see it called LXX, which is the Roman numerals for 70. It's L7X10. So, in this translation, you got the 53 books are arranged by the Torah, history, poetry, and prophecy. That's how they arranged it back then. None of the books are changing, but it's just the way they're arranging them. Now, AD 500, 500 years after Jesus has come on the scene, you would wonder what is happening with the Jewish scriptures. Who's looking after them? Well, there were some dudes before called the Talmudists, Talmudists, right? And these guys were copying out the scriptures, and they were doing it in a very strict way so that there were no mistakes. But after them came these guys called the Masoretes. And this is AD 50. Now, these were special Jewish scribes, and they were entrusted with the sacred task of making copies of Hebrew scriptures. And that was in between the period of 500 AD to 900 AD. They had nothing to do with Jesus whatsoever. These were Jews, right? And they developed a meticulous system of counting the number of words in each book of the Bible to make sure it was copied accurately. What they would do was, when they'd finished writing a book, and first let me just tell you the way people copied things in those days. I think this started off with the Talmudists. This word here, any scroll found to have an error. If you or I were copying it down, we would say, any scroll found, to have an error, and we would copy it like that. And I tell you, we would have mistakes. Reason why I know, because on this PowerPoint I made loads of mistakes in the last couple of days. Just looking at a book, typing stuff out, and making mistakes. Now they would say A, N, Y, S, C, like that. Oh, and at the end of each one say the word, any, and then spell out scroll and then scroll. They would do it letter by letter. Now, the Masoretes, I don't know if I'm saying it right, it sounds like some cheerleading group when I say it like that. The Masoretes, Anyway, sorry, get a bit confused. These guys would, when they finished the book, they would find the middle paragraph of the book. Okay, they go through, find the middle paragraph, then they would find the middle sentence, and then the middle word, and the middle letter. And that would be the way they would check that they'd copied it right. It's like, what you got? 6. You know, if that was the equivalent of the letter. I'm not too sure, to find details. Oh, he got 7. Well, his is rubbish. Let's burn it. Or let's bury it. And that's what they do. They would then say it's rubbish, and they would get rid of it. As a result, they saw the newest copies as better than older copies. So they would keep anything that was rubbish, they would bury it, or some guys would actually give it to schools and put it in a special cupboard so that people knew this was not legit, but they could use it in schools. But otherwise it would be buried and not used. So they'd have all these fresh copies they'd done, and they're like, we know this is as good as the original, so we're happy with our fresh copy. So that was the Masoretes, AD 500. Then you've got the Apocrypha. We've all heard about this. A lot of people ask questions about it. The Apocrypha refers to several books and editions that were included in the early Greek and Latin translations of the Old Testament. Now, the Septuagint contained the Apocrypha way back in 100 years BC. So you could think, uh-oh, maybe it was supposed to be in the Bible. But by the 1st century AD, so within 200 years of the Septuagint coming out, there were writers like Philo and Josephus, and you probably heard Josephus mentioned a lot of time, famous Jewish historian. They indicated that the Hebrew canon did not include the Apocrypha. Now, when we say Hebrew canon, canon is the word for rule. Not as in a king ruling, but as in measuring something. Checking something is straight. The canon says these books are legit, inspired books that God gave us. And the Jewish people say, nah, the Apocrypha was never part of the canon. Okay? So, but the Catholic Church had it in their Bible for a long, long time. And a lot of people said, look, we know it's not the word of God, but it's useful for historical purposes. And back in AD 1640, it was removed from the Geneva Bible. And by AD 1827, it was omitted from most English versions of the Bible. And today it's not in most English versions of the Bible. So that's the Apocrypha. Now, these are some of the apocryphal books up there on the screen, just so you recognize the names. Bell and the Dragon, that looks like an interesting one. If you ever read them, you can kind of tell as you read them that they're not inspired word of God. They have no power to them. But they have been used by people to find out about history and Jewish culture. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls, 1947. This is the most fascinating archaeological find ever. The reason why is because up until 1947, the oldest complete Hebrew manuscripts we had of the Old Testament were the Masoretes, which meant a lot of people said, hang on a minute, the Old Testament we've got is from 900 AD. What about when it was written, started being written 1500 years BC? How do we know that the Masoretes have got the correct translations? And of course, people would say, well, the Jewish scribes were very accurate. But people weren't having that. And then in 1947, they found the Dead Sea Scrolls in a cave. There's a shepherd boy out with his sheep, and he chucks a stone, and his stone ends up falling into a cave near the Dead Sea. And he's like, ooh, what's in there? Goes in there, finds all this old stuff, really old stuff. The greatest archaeological find ever. Now, this had all kinds of documents in it. It wasn't just Bible documents. It had the Apocrypha in there, and it had lots of writings. There had basically been a community living there called the Essenes. You heard that name before? The Essenes. They lived there. They had nothing to do with Jesus. If you read the book, The Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown goes on about how these guys had a political agenda and they were trying to twist things about Jesus. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was found nothing about Jesus. Okay, absolutely nothing. We've only got stuff that tells us about the Old Testament, nothing about Jesus. These guys were a Jewish sect. They had nothing to do with Jesus. Now, the copies they found were made between 100 years before Christ and 100 years after Christ. That's the time period. Okay, they found these Dead Sea Scrolls. There's loads of Old Testament manuscripts in there. Now, check it out. They found a scroll of Isaiah. And that is a picture of it there. A scroll of Isaiah. It's the oldest complete manuscript of any book of the Bible, and this copy was made around 100 years before Christ. So up till this point, they only had something 900 AD, and now they find something 900 years older. So you could guess what the first thing they're going to do is see, does this copy we've just found match copies that were made 900 years later? Did the Jewish scribes get it right, or has the Old Testament been corrupted? Now, they found that these copies were remarkably close to the standard Hebrew Bible, and they only varied slightly in the spelling of some names. Now, you all know that spelling changes over time. Like, these days, I spell a lot of words with a Z, which is actually the American spelling. Because we got Microsoft, and the spelling check always goes on American, no matter what you do to it, put it on UK, the next minute it's on American. Every time you write down a word that ends with an I's, which in English would be I-S-E, spell check wants to change it to I-Z-E. So I gave up in the end. I just put the Z's in there. It looks better anyway, but it's the American way of spelling it. a lot of English people now are using American spellings when they write. And the way we spell now is different to the way they did in the 1600s. So spelling changes, so that's not a big deal. But what this did, this discovery, was it gave overwhelming confirmation of the reliability of the Masoretic copies. Now, check this out. To give you an example of how close they are, in Isaiah 53, they went to the chapter Isaiah 53, and I'm going to quote this. In one chapter, i.e. Isaiah 53, there is only one word, 3 letters, in question after 1,000 years of transmission, and this word does not significantly change the meaning of the passage. Some archaeologist said that. Sorry, can't remember who it was. But you can look it up in your Bibles. The word is light. And if you look it up in your Bibles, it normally tells you at the bottom, it says, or light. And when you look at it, it doesn't change the meaning of it. But this was the one, 3 letters. And all the words in Isaiah 53, there were just 3 letters that were different, and it was this one word. Doesn't change the meaning of the passage. Now, moving on. When you got to the 60s, we're going to talk about the Ugaritic grammar. Okay? The Ugaritic grammar, well, a Ugaritic grammar was published in the 1960s. Now, Ugaritic is an ancient language that's similar to Hebrew, and it helps scholars to understand Hebrew vocabulary and poetry. This can be one of the advantages of looking at Bible translations that were written since the 60s, because they know more about Hebrew grammar. They found this stuff, and they're like, aha, we can better translate Hebrew Bibles now because we understand how it works. Now, before we move on to the next step, just want to recap. You've got the Septuagint, which was translated into Greek, and then you've got the Masoretic texts, which were, by the way, put in Hebrew again. And one of the reasons why was because Christians were using the Septuagint. So you can imagine the Jews were getting kind of annoyed. The Christians are using the same Bible as us. We want to separate. So they was like, let's go back to Hebrew. Now, when they compared the Masoretic texts with the Septuagint texts, although you have to translate, obviously, from Greek to Hebrew, they found them remarkably similar. Then when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found them remarkably similar. So what we can say is that the Old Testament has been accurately transmitted to us over the years. So it hasn't been corrupted. But the next thing I'm going to look at is the Old Testament historically accurate? Is it historically accurate? A lot of people think it's a myth, but boy, wait till you see this. Nelson Kluick, he's a renowned Jewish archaeologist, and he's the former president of the Hebrew University in Cincinnati. Now, he said, it may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. As far as he's concerned, no one's found anything in archaeology that's ever controverted what a biblical reference was, what the Bible said, and never found anything that disagrees with it. Now, he also says, at one time, scholars argued that Moses couldn't have written the Pentateuch because writing didn't exist in his lifetime. Remember what the Pentateuch was? The 5 books. It's also called the Law, okay? People said Moses couldn't have written that because they didn't even have writing. It didn't exist. Man was so primitive, he couldn't have written it. Ha ha. And people were like, oh no, these archaeologists have disproved Christianity. Oh no. Well, they got egg on their face now, because then, I'd say that, then the black stele, or stele, I don't know how to pronounce it. No, I don't know anyone who uses this word, but I'll tell you what it is. It's like a handle thing. Comes up in archaeology quite a bit. Anyway, it was discovered containing writing that predated Moses by at least 3 centuries. That's 300 years. So one minute they're saying Moses couldn't have written it. He didn't even know how to write. And then an archaeological discovery says, uh-oh, here's something that was written 300 years before Moses turned up. Therefore, writing did exist. Now, okay, so they lost the Moses one, but then people are like, what about King David? King David is a crucial character, a crucial part of Christianity and Judaism. Now, some radical scholars once suggested that David, the shepherd king of Israel, was a mythical figure. I'm quoting the same guy. Right? People were saying, nah, David was just a myth. People love saying that about the Bible. Finishing on the quote, until a 1993 excavation unearthed a 9th century BC tablet referring to the house of David. I'm going to show you a picture of this in a minute. Okay? They actually found something that was written 900 years before Jesus referring to the house of David. Therefore, it wasn't a myth. Okay, so once again, the people who come up with their funny theories were disproved. Now, then there's this one. Daniel's mention of the last Babylonian king, Belshazzar, in Daniel 5, was once thought to be an embarrassing mistake. Right? This is what our friend says. They thought that. It was like, Daniel says the last Babylonian king is called Belshazzar. That's wrong because, following on the quote, since a clay tablet named Nabonidus, not Belshazzar, as the last king of Babylon. So they found a tablet that said the last king of Babylon was called Nabonidus. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. So they're like, the Bible's wrong. Check this out. Later discoveries confirmed that Belshazzar, the son of Nabonidus, ruled as co-regent with his father. It was his dad. They ruled together. People thought the Bible had got it wrong. Later they found out the Bible had got it right. Now the fact that people didn't know this stuff for a long time shows that the Bible must have been written at the time these things happened, because later history covered it up. We're talking about way back when people didn't have computer hard drives that they could save information on, or the kind of libraries we have these days. That libraries today still burn in fires, but back in those days libraries are going to get destroyed much quicker than libraries these days. So something like this about Belshazzar, after the time, people wouldn't have known about it. So no one could have written up a fake. They wouldn't have known. It's only with archaeology we got today, they find stuff and they're like, there was a guy called Belshazzar. So it shows that these events in the Bible were written at the time they had. They weren't written a few hundred years later. Now, another guy, Dr. Robert Dick Wilson. He was a historian and he was a linguist. Now, he spent 15 years studying the necessary languages which you need to do to study archaeology. And by the way, let me point out, some of the modern archaeologists that slate the Bible and Christianity and Christian archaeologists, a lot of the guys who came through in the 70s, who made a big name for themselves, they didn't study ancient Eastern and biblical languages. So they would say, no, these guys have got it wrong. But if you don't know the languages at the time, how can you call yourself a proper archaeologist? So this guy, anyway, he knew his stuff, 15 years studying them. Then he spent 15 years studying the text of the Old Testament. It's not really a consecutive 15 years, you know. He also spent 15 years writing and speaking. Well, we all do. But he was actually writing important pamphlets and books and speaking at conventions and stuff. Now this guy, he says, quote, there are 29 ancient kings whose names are mentioned not only in the Bible, but also on monuments of their own time. There are 195 consonants in these 29 proper names. There are only 2 or 3 out of the entire 195 consonants about which there can be any question of their being written in exactly the same way as they were inscribed on their own monuments. End quote. So what he's saying is that all these names of kings in the Bible, their names are spelt and written exactly the same way on monuments that archaeologists have found when they've excavated out in the desert and all these places where stuff's hidden underground. And he says there's only a few consonants that are out of place. Now you might think, oh, but what about those few consonants? Well, when you check out the way historians record stuff, you'll find that this is actually a miracle because, well, let me finish off the quote. Some of these go back for 2,000 years, some for 4,000. And then it says, are so written that every letter is clean and correct. Now compare this accuracy with that of other writing. Take the list. Made by the greatest scholar of his age, the librarian at Alexandria in 200 BC. Now, there was a famous library in Alexandria at 200 BC. Did I just say 2000? I meant to say 200. Okay, at 200 BC. Now, remember what I was saying, that those few consonants changing was a miracle compared to how history normally works. This guy, the librarian at Alexandria, he compiled a catalogue of the kings of Egypt. Now you think, oh, that's pretty good. And this was a famous library, so this must be really accurate. He named 38 kings in all, and only 4 are recognizable. Okay? He also made a list of the kings of Assyria. Only 1 is recognizable. And that one is not spelled correctly. So the one name of a king that they can find is spelt incorrectly. Compare that with the Bible, where it had all the names of the kings right, and there was just a few consonants that were different. Now, this same guy, Robert Dick Wilson, he talks about a guy called Ptolemy. Always had difficulty saying that. Now, this guy drew up a register of 18 of the kings of Babylon. Not one is spelled correctly. Normally, you'd imagine when they find an archaeological dig, they'd be like, whatever here is true. Well, that's not the case. But when you find these biblical stories, you find it is the case. The scribes who wrote down the Old Testament were so precise. Now, this same Dr. Robert Dick Wilson says, if anyone talks against the Bible, ask him about the kings mentioned in it. There are 29 kings, including Egypt, Israel, Moab, Damascus, Tyre, Babylon, Assyria, and Persia. And 10 different countries, all of which, 1 are included in the Bible account, 2 are found on monuments in those countries. So what he says is every one of these is given his right name in the Bible, the right country, and the right chronological order. Compare that with these other guys, non-biblical accounts where they find hardly any of the names are recognizable, and when they are, they're spelt wrong anyway. And in the Bible, when it talks about a king, it gives them the right name, puts them in the right country, and puts them in the right chronological order. This shows us the Bible isn't myth. The Bible can be seen as a historical account. What's in there is historically correct. Now, using the information taken from Egyptian monuments and ancient literature, like Josephus, Eusebius, there were about 40 kings living from 2000 BC to 400 BC. Okay, 40 kings. Now, this is based on Egyptian monuments and ancient literature, right? Now, each of these appears in chronological order in the Old Testament with reference to the kings of the same country and with respect to the kings of other countries. Okay, the Bible's correct. There's complete agreement between secular sources and the Old Testament. Now, what he says, the big point about this, not only is that it's historically accurate, but as Dr. Wilson says, that the Hebrew text should have been transmitted accurately by copyists through so many centuries is a phenomena unequaled in the history of literature. You won't find anything else in the world that is as close to what really happened in that time period as the Bible. It is the most historically accurate book in the whole world from that time period. Now, the Bible. Is it fact, is it fiction, or is it fable? I mean, hopefully I've just proved to you what it is, but there are some people that still like to say it's fable, that it's mythical, especially talking about Genesis and the rest of the Pentateuch. A lot of people say those first 5 books written by Moses were myth. Now, check it out. They found the Mari tablets in 1936. You want to remember this. Mari tablets in 1936. Now, a guy called André Perot, he excavated thousands of cuneiform tablets from 1700 BC. Cuneiform means wedge, and they're a type of tablets you'll find in archaeology. That's all I'll say about it, because that's all I know about it. So they found these. They're from 1700 BC. Okay? Now, this is what Albright says. Now, let me just tell you, Albright is known as the biggest biblical archaeological scholar ever in the world. He started off as a liberal. He was one of these guys who said, oh, it's mythical. And as he studied archaeology, he was like, it's not, it's fact. And he became a conservative. That's what they call it. Now, he says, quote, the latest discoveries at Mari on the Middle Euphrates have strikingly confirmed the Israelite traditions according to which their Hebrew forefathers came to Palestine from the region of Haran in northwestern Mesopotamia. That's what he says. Now, he also says in another book, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob no longer seem isolated figures, much less reflections of later Israelite history. They now appear as true children of their age, bearing the same names, moving about over the same territory, visiting the same towns, especially Haran and Nahor, practicing the same customs as their contemporaries. In other words, the patriarchal narratives have a historical nucleus throughout. And this guy is like the leading authority on biblical archaeology. Started off as a liberal and was convinced by his own findings that the Bible was fact. Now, in the Bible, you've got the story of Abraham migrating from a place called Ur to Canaan. If you look on a map, Ur is like Babylon, like all the way over there, say at the far end of the screen. And then you've got like Canaan over here, and then you've got the Mediterranean Sea up here. Now, critics said that couldn't have happened because people didn't travel that far in those days. They even said that people in those days didn't know extensive travel. Like, they didn't know it. Like, you had no concept of traveling that far. Like, people wouldn't travel that far. They were backward, you know. Now, Babylonian excavations at Mari, remember the Mari tablets, they found a tablet dated in the era of Abraham that was a wagon contract. Like when you go to rent a car, you have to do a contract. Now, the wagon was leased to a man for a year on the condition that it would not be driven to Kittim, which is the coastland of the Mediterranean Sea. Mediterranean Sea here, and Babylon all the way over there. Okay, the same route that Abraham would take to Canaan. Okay, now what this shows us is that it was common in Abraham's time to drive wagons over the route from Babylonia to Canaan or the vicinity around it. Everyone get that? So if anyone says they didn't travel in those days, say, what about the Mari tablets when they found the contract about the wagon? Now, another story. Genesis 14 talks about Abraham's victory over Chedorlaomer and the Mesopotamian kings. Now, this is a huge battle story. Now, critics thought it was impossible for 4 kings from the Persian Gulf to make a raid as far as the Sinai Peninsula. It was like, that's too far. Kings wouldn't do that. They also thought it was impossible that these guys captured 4 city princes, and that after that, Abraham, at the head of 318 servants, recaptured what they had robbed. They're like, not possible. Now, Albright agreed with them and even wrote about this in 1918. But as a result of his own archaeological discoveries in 1929, he changed his mind and said that Genesis 14 can no longer be considered as unhistorical in view of the many confirmations of details which we owe to recent finds. He actually found a passageway that kings used, a long passageway to go down to wage war. And he found lots of things, and he was basically like, Genesis 14 really happened. Albright used to think it was propaganda, that the Jews wrote it as a story to try it like with propaganda. And then he said, no, it's true. Now, as well as the Mari tablets, they found the Nuzi tablets. Nuzi tablets. Now, the Nuzi tablets, according to a guy called Horn, quote, the discovery of a whole archive of legal and social texts at Nuzi, a small place in northeastern Iraq, has revealed that the social and legal background of the patriarchal age is reflected accurately in great detail in the Old Testament patriarchal narratives. And a guy called Wright says, Nuzi tablets elucidate, which means kind of like to lighten, many a custom typical of the patriarchal age in the second millennium, but not of Israelite life in the first. Now check this out. Have you ever heard stories in the Bible where you've just thought, that's weird? Like, why would they do that? Really weird stories. Like, remember when Laban is chasing after his daughter and Jacob, and they've stolen the family idols. And he wants his family idols, and you think, why would he chase them for days for the family idols? It's like, you know, it's just like something off the mantelpiece. Now later, archaeologists found that if you had the family idols, you then had a legal right to claim their inheritance. Okay, I think it was, yeah, it was inheritance or estate. It was some legal right. So it was like, boy, if someone's got your passport, you want to get that passport back. I know, recent experiences, right? So archaeology, now what this guy's saying about the Nuzi tablets is stuff they found on the Nuzi tablets explain a lot of the Old Testament stories. So stuff that people used to think was mythical, people are now like, that wasn't mythical, that was what happened in those days. Now what Wright is saying in this quote, where he says it was stuff from the second millennium, that means 2,000 years before Christ. Everyone get that? Second millennium is actually 2,000 years before Christ. First millennium is 1,000 years before Christ. So which happened first, second millennium or first millennium? Second. Right, cool. So he's saying the stuff that they found in the Bible, it reflects the second millennium, but not the first. Now, as I was alluding to earlier, in the first millennium, if stuff was written, they wouldn't have been able to include customs found in the second millennium, because it was 1,000 years ago, and they didn't have archaeology like they do these days. They wouldn't have known about those weird customs. They would have thought they were weird as well, which shows that the weird customs we find in the Bible are factual. They were written in the second millennium. They couldn't have been written in the first millennium, because it's only now that we've uncovered all this stuff. Now, check it out. A guy called Gordon says, the cuneiform contracts from Nuzu, should say Nuzi, it's probably a typo, have demonstrated that the social institutions of the patriarchs are genuine and pre-Mosaic. They cannot have been invented by any post-Mosaic. They cannot have been invented by any post-Mosaic J, E, D, or P. Do you know what I mean by J, E, D, or P? You saw that dodgy TV show last year on Christmas? What a load of junk. And in it they were claiming that the book of Moses, the 5 books, weren't written by Moses, but were written by a dude they called J, a dude called E, D, and P, and written much later. This guy here, Gordon, is saying that's not possible. Because of the customs employed, we now know they were only known about 1,000 years before. They couldn't have been written by someone after Moses. Now, here's an example about how the Nuzi tablets help us. They found laws and marriage contracts from these tablets that mention barren wives giving maidservants to their husbands to produce children. Now, that should remind you about Abraham. And remember his wife Sarah, she lets him have a maidservant that he can sleep with to produce a child, because Sarah's not able to produce children. It also happened with Jacob. He had 2 wives. He had Rachel and he had Leah, and both of them gave him maidservants to try and have more kids. Now, we think that's proper weird. But the Nuzi tablets, actually, they found one which has got a marriage contract, right? And it shows the bride, Kelem Ninu, promises in written form to procure for her husband, Shenima, a slave girl as a second wife if she fails to bear him children. She also promises that she will not drive out the offspring of such a union. That's quoted from Horn. Now that should ring bells, because remember, Sarah drove Hagar and Ishmael out into the wilderness. And you think, well, that's weird. But the Nuzi tablets show that someone actually, for a marriage certificate, actually said, I promise I'm not going to do that. Which shows us it's not some weird mythical story. It actually happened. So that's Nuzi. Now we've also got this thing. This isn't Nuzi. This is something else. Do you remember Genesis 23? Abraham wants to bury his wife Sarah, and he goes to buy a cave from the Hittites. And they end up selling him the cave and the land. There's a bit of haggling going on. And you think, why did he have to buy the land as well? Well, according to a guy called Frank, the Hittite practice of having to buy not just the cave but the land with it was confirmed by Hittite documents recovered from Bog-Hazkoi, place called Bog-Hazkoi. Okay? They found Hittite documents showing that it was the practice to not just buy the cave but buy the land as well. Shows fact. You know what? Even more fact? They used to say there was no such thing as Hittites. Oh, the Bible made them up. There's no such thing as Hittites. Well, they found all these Hittite documents. You know. Now, check this out. The Assyrian attack of Hezekiah. That was real. It's called the Taylor Prism on the picture there. And it says, I, in brackets, Sennacherib, captured 46 towns and villages of Judah. Shut up Hezekiah the Jew like a bird in a cage in Jerusalem, his royal city, 701 BC. Shows us that Hezekiah existed, who's mentioned in the Bible. Shows us that Hezekiah was laid siege to by Sennacherib. Really happened. There's a picture of it. Right, then you've got towers in Babel. Towers in Babel? Could there really have been towers in Babel from these people? Well, look at that at the bottom picture. A ziggurat at Ur. I'm not saying that is the Tower of Babel, but I'm saying they made towers in this area. Okay? Now, what about a real stairway to the gods? In Genesis 11, it's talking about how God doesn't let them build the Tower of Babel. They want to ascend up to the gods. Now, Sumerian tablets record that the builders were displeasing the gods, the builders of this place, who prevented them from completing the towers to the moon gods. Sumerian accounts, some people argue these are the oldest people in the world. It's not true, but they are very old accounts. And they say that they were building a tower up to God, up to the moon gods, and the gods were displeased with them and stopped them. Now check it out. How do you know if something's a myth? Well, you look at it and you see, does it look like a historical account or does it look like a mythical account? Now, when you look at any Bible story in the Old Testament, well-known one like creation or the flood or the Tower of Babel, it's written as a historical account. It's written in a factual way, although it can be used, because Hebrew is a colourful language, it's written colourfully. All the Sumerian accounts are written in a very mythical way. So, for example, Tower of Babel, we've got how it works. Now, on the Sumerian tablets, it says there's these moon gods. Straight away sounds a bit mythical. And then these moon gods stop them. Now, if you check out the story of the flood, again it says the gods were displeased at man because man was too noisy and it was keeping the gods up at night time. So then they sent a big flood to destroy them. Now ask yourself, which is the mythical account? Noah and the ark, or the dudes who were waking the gods up in the middle of the night and had a flood sent to them? So if anyone says, the Sumerian accounts came before the Bible, not true. It's clear that the Genesis accounts happened first, then the Sumerians got it into their folklore and used that. Enough of that. The seal of Baruch, Jeremiah's scribe. Now in Jeremiah it talks about his scribe, Baruch, putting a seal there. Now here is actually a picture of a seal imprinted on a clay bulla, 650 to 600 BC. And it says there, belonging to Baruch-Yahu, son of Neriyahu, the scribe. Then we got the city of David, real. His remains of a Jebusite and Davidic walls. City of David. Then you got the prophecy of Cyrus. It actually happened in the book of Isaiah, 44, verse 28, 700 years before Christ. You've got Isaiah prophesying that the Jews would be restored and Jerusalem would be rebuilt, and this would happen by the Lord's appointed named Cyrus. A guy called Cyrus, God decided he's going to be the guy that will do it. And this cylinder here, right, this shows, it's basically, it records the decree of Cyrus, king of the Medes and the Persians, who released the captives of Babylon and supported rebuilding temples in their homelands, 536 BC. Which was about 200 years later. So the prophecy Isaiah gave was around 700 years BC, and this was 536 years BC. So not only are we seeing historical accuracy, but also seeing prophecy fulfilled. It's quite amazing. Then I promised you I'd show you this one. Is David a mythical character? Well, they found this at a place called Dan. And it says there, I know none of us can read this language, it says DVDTEB, and what it means is the house of David. Obviously David existed because someone's got a document here where they're talking about the house of David. We're going to find many more things over these years, especially because archaeology has been getting better and better with the methods they're using. So they keep finding stuff that proves the Bible. If anyone ever says to you, what about this? And if you don't know an answer for it, just say to them, stick around. Wait a few years, because archaeology will disprove that theory. It always does. It's never once controverted something that's in the Bible. Now, Egypt's advanced culture was real. We all know that now, obviously. But, you know, the Bible talked about it first. You know, remember you saw it in the Bible first. All the stuff about the Egyptians, no one would disagree with that now. You've got Genesis 37, Exodus 15, all through there you've got stuff about the Egyptians. Now, the flood. We talked about the flood. I said how the Sumerian account is blatantly a mythical account because it says that they kept the gods awake and the gods sent a flood. But this here, this found at Gilgamesh, lots of writing, and I'll read a bit of it out. I boarded the ship and closed the door. Storm, tempest raged. All frightened by the flood, all mankind was turned to clay. Dove sent out, returns. Raven sent out, stays. Sacrifice at mountain. Now, it's pretty clear that this is talking about Noah's flood. It's pretty clear. Someone written about it. And this is old. I mean, look at it. It's old. You know, mythical story? I don't think so. This is called the Gilgamesh epic. So if anyone asks you about the flood, say, what about the Gilgamesh epic? Then you've got Solomonic gates at Hazor. Now in Joshua 11, verse 11, it talks about Hazor being burned by the Israelites. And they found this stuff there. Just going to go through these quickly. Sorry about the quality of these. I got these pictures here off the internet. I couldn't get a high resolution one. Now, here you've got King Hezekiah's seal. We've already established Hezekiah was around because we had that document from Sennacherib bragging about what how he'd laid siege to Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, he said. And here you got this. It says, belonging to Hezekiah, in brackets, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, which is what we find in the Bible. And it's got a common motive of a beetle pushing a dung ball across outstretched wings. Okay, so Hezekiah was really there. Hezekiah's tunnel. They found this. It goes from the Gihon spring to the Siloam pool. I've actually been there. I've seen it. It's really there. It wasn't made up. It was there in the Bible. It's there. You can go and see it today. 2 Chronicles, chapter 32, verses 3 to 4 and verse 30. And it says it channeled the water. So. Then you've got Hezekiah's broad wall. And back to the Hittites. Remember they said, no, there's no such thing as Hittites. It's made up. It's mythical. Here are the gates to the capital city, Hattusha. They found a whole bunch of stuff that now shows the Hittites were a real people group that existed back then. They've even found documents. And here's a gate. Obviously, it's not what our gates look like these days. Then you've got the whole idea of there Israel in Canaan. Did that really happen? Well, you've got the stele. Does anyone know how you pronounce this? Is it still stele? Stele of Merempta, which was 1213 BC, and they found the word Israel. Then you've got this quote, Canaan has been plundered, Israel has been devastated, having no seed. This is the oldest record of Israel, and it's just after the occupation of Canaan. So you've actually got documents which talk about Israel and Canaan, showing the link there. Then you've got the kings Jehu and Omri. You've got a black obelisk here of Shalmaneser, and this is the obelisk, and here's a close-up, and it says Jehu, son of Omri, and they're bringing tribute to Assyria. This is around 841 BC, so another person in the Bible that they found really existed from archaeology. Then you got Jericho. People thought Jericho wasn't real, but they found ruins. It's remained unoccupied since 1500 BC, but it was established around 6000 BC, according to this person. I don't know if that's true, but they found ruins. I've been to this place as well. I've checked it out. You can go and see it. Then you've got back to our friend Sennacherib again. Here you've got siege engines, which is how they reckon Sennacherib attacked Lachish 701 BC. Now, if I go to another picture here, you might see it clearer. These are actually remains of a siege ramp. So you can actually see a real siege ramp there, which backs up how Sennacherib did what he did. Then you've got the old Jerusalem. You know, you can go there, you can walk in the old city of Jerusalem. It's got the gates with their names. And you can see that Jerusalem really existed the way it did back in the Bible. You got the temple. Obviously, the temple doesn't still exist. It was demolished by the Romans. But you've got enough stuff to show you that the temple really was real. In the Bible, it keeps talking about a temple in the Old Testament. And there's archaeological evidence to show that there was a temple. Then you got the prophecy of Tyre. Now, we're kind of moving into prophecy here, but it still fits in with history. This was the prophecy, right? Tyre and Sidon were sister cities of the Phoenician origin, right? Now, Tyre was to be destroyed, according to the prophecy in the Bible, its riches cast into the sea and to become a place for the spreading of nets. You can find that in Zechariah 9, verse 4. Okay? Then this is what actually happened. Okay, that was the prophecy. This is what happened. Tyre was destroyed by Persians, and the people retreated to the island offshore and rebuilt the new city of Tyre on the island. Then Alexander the Great used the rubble of the former city to build a causeway to the island, and he literally threw the city of Zechariah's prophecy into the sea, never to be rebuilt. Sidon, in contrast, was destroyed, rebuilt and occupied continually during the same span of history. So we actually see this happen. Tyre destroyed and its riches cast into the sea. We actually see that happen. So prophecy fulfilled in the Bible. Now, how did all this happen? This is the point I'm getting to, right? Either 40 men who are, authors of the Bible got very lucky with their history after the events when people didn't know about the customs that happened 1,000 years before, and even before the events, saying what's going to happen with Tyre and Sidon, or this is the work of one true author, one framer of history called God. And he gave inspiration to people to write books that was really God speaking through them, and that is how we got the Bible. God-breathed, inspired Old Testament. And I think everything we looked at tonight shows that the Bible is historically accurate, and it's amazing how accurate it is, that it fulfills prophecy. Not only that, but the fact that with all the different writers in all the different locations, everything they write about, they agree with one another, which is one of the reasons why we believe the Old Testament is the Word of God. And we also believe the Old Testament we read today is the same Old Testament they read back then, because of the findings of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Septuagint, and the Masoretic texts. Now, in the next session, next week, we're going to look at, is the Old Testament scientifically accurate? And we're also going to look at what is inspiration when we say the Bible is inspired. Does the Bible really claim to be inspired? How did inspiration work? Did Jesus think the Old Testament was inspired? And the last thing we're going to look at is all the big prophecies fulfilled in the Bible, the Old Testament prophecies that were fulfilled that show us it's not just a history book, but it's a supernatural book that God wrote. What I mean is it was written supernaturally, and it tells the future.